The United States is involved in many endless wars, both home and abroad. In the past 5 decades, Americans have watched their country extend its military power to what seemed the very ends of the earth. But how did the United States find itself trapped in endless wars? And what might it do to break free? In this special episode of the book series, I called a professor of history who's currently serving as the chairperson of the International Relations Program in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. His new book, A World of Enemies, America's Wars at Home and Abroad from Kennedy to Biden, was published by Harvard University Press, and a copy of it can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. We spoke earlier this morning. Professor Osamah Khalil, thank you so much for making the time. I'm happy to have you today to talk about your book.
Yeah.
I'll just give you this opportunity to just briefly talk about yourself,
Sure.
the classes that you are teaching. Particularly, I'm very much interested in these 2 courses that you've been teaching this previous spring semester, the history of international relations,
Right.
and the other one, Vietnam movies, memoirs, and the shaping of public memory. If you can briefly talk about the core contents of those courses, it will be of great benefit to our student community who might want to enroll for these classes.
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me. So I'm a professor of history here at Syracuse, and I'm also chair of the undergraduate international relations program. And I teach a wide range of classes, everything from the history of U.S. foreign relations to the global Cold War to the Cold War and popular culture, to also the classes you mentioned, which is a graduate class in the history of international relations, which walks students through kind of the rise of international relations, not just in the West, quote unquote, but also bringing in examples from Eastern international relations to the present day. The other class is Vietnam and popular culture and the shaping of popular memory. And that actually teaching that class actually influenced the new book. So that's one where I walk students through the Vietnam War, America's experience in Vietnam, right? What becomes known as the American War in Vietnam, or in the United States, the Vietnam War. And here students interact with both memoirs from soldiers, from members of the Vietnamese insurgency, what the Americans call the Viet Cong, but the National Liberation Front, to nonfiction, and nonfictional, not just memoirs from individuals like Secretary of Defense, rather, Robert McNamara, but also diaries of, for example, a North Vietnamese doctor who went to go into the South to assist the insurgency, in a diary of hers that was recovered after she was killed. There's also the quote unquote fictional memoir, The Sympathizer, which is a wonderful book that students have really engaged with and really enjoy. So they get a number of different insights into the conflict, into America's view of the conflict, the Vietnamese view of the conflict, and then what it's paired with are films from the United States and from Vietnam. So a combination of feature films, documentaries, and as well as from both the Vietnamese perspective and the American perspective. So that's one where I think it's a great class. I enjoy teaching it. We also work into a number of the popular culture classes, the role of music. So the 1960s, 1970s are a very vibrant time. And so getting students to understand that when we think of the 1960s, you can think of it in several different ways, and it bleeds into the 1970s. The 1970s bleed back into the 1960s. So, kind of giving them a broad swath. And that also is the same with some of the other classes I teach. Some of them are online classes, some of them are in person, but also related to popular culture. Some other classes I teach include America and the Middle East. So kind of an area of specialization of mine, and that's it. And those are a combination of classes I teach here at Syracuse, and I've been doing it now going on to my 14th year.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I understand that in this book, you argue that the militarization of the United States domestic and foreign affairs was the product of America's failure in Vietnam.
Mm.
What would you say are the core ideas of this book, and what is its central argument?
So the central argument is the following. One of the things that we tend to think of is that the domestic sphere, domestic politics, domestic policy are separate and distinct from foreign policy. And one of the things I want the reader to understand is that these two are not separate and distinct. In fact, they intersect and they influence each other. And so what we've seen is that not only has domestic policy been exported as part of U.S. foreign policy, but domestic politics have influenced U.S. foreign policy in a number of different ways. What I also demonstrate is that U.S. foreign policy has come home through a number of these different conflicts, whether it's the war on crime, the war on drugs, or the war on terror. So these are not separate and distinct. It's not just that we're fighting the war on terror abroad, we're fighting it quote unquote at home. And it has an influence that also kind of seeps into and is influenced by and then further influences things like the war on crime and the war on drugs. So that's at one level. At the second level, what I'd like the readers to take away is the following: that U.S. foreign policy has become increasingly militarized. The emphasis on diplomacy has really been abandoned, and I think that's demonstrated very clearly from the Vietnam period to the present. And so I try and demonstrate that and in the book. So how has U.S. foreign policy been militarized, and how has that actually influenced domestic policing as well? So what we see is kind of these two intersecting tracks. That is, U.S. foreign policy has been militarized. Domestic policing has also been militarized on a parallel and on what appears to be a parallel track, but they're actually intersecting and they influence each other.
Mm-hmm.
The third piece that I want the reader to take away is we talk a lot about, and there's been a great discussion about American primacy, particularly in the post-World War II era.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a flip side to American primacy, and that is the fear or the perception of American decline. And so one of the things I trace out in the book is the role of this perception of American decline, real or perceived, during and after the Vietnam War to the present day, and how that has been evidenced and actually influences the increased militarization of U.S. foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
So one of these ideas is that because America has the strongest military in the world, that it can be used in any number of conflicts, that as opposed to diplomacy. And this increasing reliance on military force as opposed to diplomacy has several implications. One, military force is often unable to achieve what policymakers think it will.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what they've promised the American public that it will achieve. So we saw this in Vietnam. We saw it again in Afghanistan and Iraq, and in several conflicts in between, either direct or indirect U.S. involvement. And so when military force doesn't achieve what American policymakers claim it's going to, it actually feeds into and serves to drive more of this notion that America is in decline, right? Mm-hmm. This attempt to shape the world in America's image, which is a constant effort. Now, look, you could trace it to the end of World War II, but you could also trace it back further, right? But shaping the world in America's image and the attempt to do this by military force has had intended and unintended consequences. And one of them is this increased perception of American decline. And so that you can see at several different key moments, as I talk about in the book. In the initial post-Vietnam era, you see it at the end of the Reagan administration. You actually see it only a few years later at the end of the Cold War, these perceptions that actually, even though the United States, quote unquote, won the Cold War, it is in decline. Then you have it again during and after the war on terror with the 2008 financial crisis, and of course the election of Donald Trump. And that's something that actually the Trump presidency taps into very much so, this idea of make America great again. Built into that idea is the fact that the United States is in decline. And so I think we're seeing that yet again in the midst of another presidential campaign.
You decided to particularly focus on the period from the presidency of John F. Kennedy, and then up until the time of the current president Joe Biden. What is particularly or specifically and outstandingly unique about this particular time frame than any other time in the history of the United States?
Well, that's a great question. So there are several key things about the Kennedy presidency that are important. One is, Kennedy is going to inspire, and this is one of the things I trace out in the book, is going to inspire the baby boom generation. And what they will do is that members of that generation will come into the Foreign Service, the CIA, the military, right, and several other related agencies. And they will have a profound influence on U.S. foreign policy, whether it is at state, it is at CIA or another branch of the intelligence community or the military. And Vietnam will be their testing ground. And so what happens is they will draw different lessons from Vietnam. They don't all draw the same lesson from the Vietnam War. But over and over again, what I show in the book is that they will refer back to the Vietnam experience for better or for worse. So part of that begins with Kennedy, much more so than Eisenhower. Okay. So that's at one level with Kennedy. The other piece is Kennedy's going to inherit the Vietnam conflict from Eisenhower. He is going to, in effect, increase America's involvement in Vietnam. Okay. And now historians can debate what Kennedy would have done, if he had lived. But several things are set in motion that President Johnson inherits, and then he makes the war his own. So in a way, it can be a challenge when you're talking about Vietnam. Where do you begin that story? Do you begin it with Truman? Do you begin it with Eisenhower? But I begin it with Kennedy for several different reasons. It includes some of the different policies that were enacted, the adoption of counterinsurgency, the assassination policies, the coup that overthrows America's ally, President Diem, to replace him with the military junta, all of which have dramatic implications for the course of the Vietnam and, of course, what President Johnson decides to do. Now, Johnson's going to make it his own war. The other piece that also separates Kennedy and kind of the Kennedy-Johnson period from Eisenhower is, for example, Eisenhower will come into office, and I debated this as I was tracing out the book. So Eisenhower will come in. The Korean War will end in a stalemate, if not an American defeat. But that doesn't impact America's standing in the world as it perceives itself. In fact, by the end of the Eisenhower administration, the idea is that America is unbounded, right? That America can face any foe. And this is exactly the language that Kennedy adopts, right? In his inauguration speech, in his famous inauguration speech that inspires so many of the baby boomers. So even though there is a failure in the Korean War, right, to achieve America's aims, it doesn't impact America's perception of itself. Vietnam has a very different perspective, a very different impact, especially when it's coupled with, for example, the Watergate scandal. So this combination of a post-Vietnam, post-Watergate malaise that kicks in after, Nixon is forced to resign, and throughout the 1970s into the 1980s has real dramatic impact. So where do you begin that story? And I thought it was best to begin that story, quite frankly, with Kennedy because of his influence on the baby boom generation. There's another aspect here I think that's interesting. When we talk about the 1960s, and I will try and get this across to my students, where do the 60s begin? And some scholars, particularly scholars of popular culture, will argue the 60s don't begin so much with the Kennedy presidency. They begin with the Kennedy assassination, right? And that sets in motion this combination of the tumultuous 60s, the combination of civil unrest at the United States, combined with the civil rights movement, the anti-campus protest movement, the range of assassinations of political leaders and figures, whether it is the Kennedy brothers, it is Malcolm X, it's Martin Luther King. There's a range of assassinations that can get, and the United States adopts a very aggressive foreign policy about attempting to contain, as I talk about in the book, contain the impact of Vietnam. That's one of the things that Johnson is going to attempt to do is how do we contain Vietnam globally, not just in Southeast Asia, but in the Middle East and in Southern Africa, and of course in Latin America. And I trace all of that out for across the book. So that's one of the reasons why I begin with Kennedy. What I wanted to also show by ending with Biden is that there are real consistencies in policies, especially in several major conflicts that really kind of drive the wars on crime, drugs, and terrors. There are consistent policies when we talk about how policing became militarized. And this doesn't just begin overnight. It begins, quite frankly, with Johnson, if you want to start there, and you can, and I draw on several other scholars to do that, from Johnson through Trump to Biden. Okay. There's the other issue of the war on drugs, where you could argue some of this begins well before Kennedy and certainly before Nixon, but it's Nixon who's going to take it and creates a template that will be adopted, particularly by Reagan, by George Herbert Walker Bush, and then consecutive presidents. There are consistencies in how the United States views and deals with a number of major conflicts, whether it is the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and peace process, whether it is the conflict in Southern Africa, as I talk about, the different conflicts in Southern Africa, or in Latin America. So there are a number of consistencies we see across what was called the Third World during the Cold War, and then becomes known as the Global South. So that's one of the key pieces I trace in the book. And I want to show that, quite frankly, even though there may be a difference in rhetoric, if you will, between the Obama, Trump, and Biden presidencies, there are a number of consistencies in policies. And unfortunately, we've seen some of that just in the past few months with the Biden presidency in its last year.
That's great. So, as you may know, we are covering this book as part of a series on U.S. foreign relations, and one of the things we are very particular about is to know the book's contribution to that conventional discourse on U.S. foreign relations. So what would you say is this book's contribution? And does it in some way challenge conventional interpretations, and does it complement them? You can explain that.
So that's a great question. So the book contributes in several different ways. The first is, of course, looking at this intersection between domestic politics and policy and its influence on foreign policy, and how foreign policy also influences domestic policy. So there are a few books that touch on parts of this. My first book touched on some aspects of this, but not in this way. The other thing I try and do in this book is then to take kind of you have two or three separate and distinct literatures. So, for example, the literature on the war on drugs is huge, right? And it's often considered separate from other literatures related to, the war on terror or the war on crime. What I've tried to do is bring these all together. So I've tried to draw on the work of several scholars as well as my own research and tie these together into one unique narrative, right? I think that the third component that I look at, which I think not many scholars have done, is to compare how the United States describes its urban areas where there are issues of crime, how that is described and how that is transported to discussing areas in the war on terror that are now considered badlands, right? So we have the transition from urban badlands in the United States, whether it be in Chicago or Philadelphia or elsewhere, to now transporting them to Pakistan, Afghanistan, Gaza, Somalia, Yemen. And so that's part of this contribution, is for us to think about these geographic imaginaries and how they have been adopted, how they influence, how they, one, reflect the perceptions of American policymakers, whether it is in the global South, looking at the global South, or looking domestically. And then two, how those global imaginaries are affected in policy, right? What does it actually mean to have a badlands? What kind of policies are adopted when you describe an area as a badlands, whether it is for urban policing or for an occupation, for example, in Iraq. And so that's one of the things where no other scholars have looked at that in that way. So that's one of the really unique contributions. The final one is on the issue of decline. So this is something that's often danced around by scholars, and of course, this is a contentious issue, if you will. And it's one of the ones that I want to grapple with, because I'm also challenging the notion that the United States is in decline. So this is a very rich rhetoric for policymakers. It's a way for them to tap into, right, kind of these existential fears of the American voter, of the American population. And what I would like the reader to think about is, one, are we really in decline, and what does that mean? But also to challenge, and I think this is where the book fits in with several other books, the forever wars that the United States has been in for the past 20 to 30 years. Why is it that war making is so consistent in U.S. culture, in U.S. policy, and how can the United States get out of this logic of war making? And that's where I think this book also fits in with several other scholars who've looked at the forever wars, but takes it in a unique way. So I think there are several major contributions that students can take away from. I think it also, this book would actually work well for several different classes, whether it's kind of, you often find classes, things like, America since 1960, right? A class on history of U.S. foreign relations, a class on the global war on terror, or a class on the war on drugs. This is the kind of, book that can be tapped into and offers, a real broad, expansive view. The other component I think where it also taps into is when I talked about the geographical imaginaries is also how race is viewed by American policymakers. And so that's racial minorities at home, as well as how does the United States view different populations overseas. And so whether it is policing them at home or it's an occupation army overseas, what kind of policies are adopted? How are they related? And so we'll see this, for example, one of the examples I give is an example some of the students may or may not be familiar with because it's effectively been wiped from history, which is what's known as the Abu Ghraib scandal, right? So Abu Ghraib was a prison in Iraq. It was one of Saddam Hussein's prisons that I think it's adopted by the U.S. military. And the U.S. military will, in its attempt to defeat the insurgency in Iraq, will start to bring prisoners of all kinds into Abu Ghraib. They're not all political prisoners, but a decision is made that they need to be, quote unquote, rough with the prisoners to break the insurgency. And so this will lead to a scandal. Why? Because what's happening is that there are photographs that are eventually leaked of U.S. soldiers and interrogators torturing, sexually abusing, and humiliating prisoners. And so when these photos are leaked, almost 6 months, 6 to 8 months before the 2004 presidential election, it causes a scandal. But it doesn't have the impact on the 2004 election that some thought it would. What's the implication back home? Well, one of the issues is some of the individuals who are in the military police are also correctional officers back in the United States or worked in prisons back in the United States. It's one of the reasons why they were assigned to the Abu Ghraib prison. Is they're actually reassigned from other duties. It's because they have prison expertise. And these are the individuals who are told by military intelligence or by the CIA that we need you to be rough on the prisoners. We need you to soften them up, to use the phrase. We want to soften them up. So what is that? Sleep deprivation, it's torture, it's uncomfortable positions, it's quite frankly, sexual assault and sexual abuse, sexual humiliation. And so what we also know from scholars who've studied, this is also an issue in American prisons. So what you see is that being transported overseas into American military prisons, and then, of course, some of that being taken back home. We also see the influence of popular culture. Some of the students may or may not know about the show 24. So 24 was a hit television show that came out almost just after the September 11th attacks. And as part of 24, which stars Kiefer Sutherland, he's part of this anti-terrorism group, kind of, and one of the goals is, so each episode is 1 hour and is a 24-hour in a day. And there's almost always some kind of ticking time bomb situation that leads Kiefer Sutherland's character, Jack Bauer, to resort to torture. And so what we see is, and what we've learned, and some reporters have talked about this, and I draw on the work of several key reporters and whistleblowers, is that in the old, and this is of course in the early 2000s, so it's pre-streaming, that DVDs of the 24 series were actually popular amongst the American military and American interrogators, who then took these techniques and then applied them in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and in some of the secret prisons. So what I want kind of the reader to take away from that is we can see both in kind of in the very big ways that domestic politics and foreign policy influence each other, but also in the very small ways and how it's operationalized on the ground.
That is actually great. Now, what would you say more comprehensively are the major findings of this book, and what major lessons can we pick from those findings?
I think that the major lesson I hope the reader takes away is the following. I'm going to do this by way of an example. The book was effectively written and was an advanced prints before the October 7th attacks. But in many ways, October 7th and the U.S. response and how the U.S. has responded to October 7th and openly citing not just openly siding with Israel, but what I would call an American war in Gaza since October 7th, is demonstrated very clearly in the book. But I think there are several telling moments that I think I'll use as anecdotes to kind of frame what the major findings are. Shortly after October 7th, Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen is asked in an interview, can the United States afford to support wars in Ukraine and in Israel? And without missing a beat, she says, absolutely. And so what I want the reader to think about and take away from, especially those who are in college right now or about to graduate, what I'd like or have just recently graduated, to think about the following. What are the many things we have been told as Americans that we cannot afford, right? Particularly if you think about in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, that we can't afford universal health care. We can't afford universal higher education. We can't afford universal daycare. We can't afford a fully funded social safety net that includes retirement. Yes. We can't afford to deal with climate change. We can't afford to deal with a green, quote unquote, Green New Deal or effective environmental policy. We can't afford, over and over again, we're told we can't afford this. We can't afford student loan relief. We can't afford to improve our infrastructure. If COVID-19 showed anything, we know our internal infrastructure, roads, bridges, et cetera, in the United States need a vast improvement. Our public health infrastructure needs a vast amount of money to be invested in it. This was fully exposed by COVID-19. Okay. All of this we can't afford, but we can always afford war. The other anecdote I would want students to take away is this. Over the past few months, what you've seen is President Biden and members of Congress advocating for foreign military aid for Ukraine and Israel. Now, the Wall Street Journal and President Biden agree on almost nothing. But the one thing that they have agreed on is that U.S. foreign military assistance brings jobs back to the United States. Right. So this is something President Biden, in promoting the foreign military assistance, promoted, and the Wall Street Journal promoted, front page. One of their few, if not only, areas of agreement. Okay. So we want to start to think about, how is war so embedded in not just our political economy, but our social and cultural aspects. If you think about every single TV show, video game, movie, but as well as the American economy, how has war become so embedded, and yet it's invisible? If you talk to most Americans today and you said to them, is the United States at war? They would say, no, we're not. Yet the United States is active in 4 or 5 military zones right now. Syria, Iraq, Gaza, Yemen, Somalia, not to mention Ukraine, not to mention U.S. forces being stationed in South Korea, not to mention U.S. special forces being deployed all around the globe, often quiet and invisible. But because the size of the U.S. military, because it's a volunteer military force, this is often invisible to most Americans. It's done without it ever being seen. So what I'd like the reader to take away, what I'd like students to start to think about is, how is war so embedded in our culture at so many different levels, and yet it is invisible to us. The third thing I would like the reader to take away, and I think this is where one of the contributions, the third anecdote I will give you is this. As the war in Gaza began to escalate, the Houthi militia in Yemen, what's known as Ansar-Allah, began to launch attacks on ships going into the Red Sea towards the Suez Canal and headed for Israel. The United States and the Houthi militia made it very clear, and I talk about in the book kind of how the Houthi militia rose from being kind of this ragtag militia to a battle-hardened militia through 7 years of war that were completely avoidable. And of course, to where they are now, with the de facto government of Yemen, de facto government and military of Yemen. But the United States, and what the Houthis said was, if there's a ceasefire in Gaza, we will halt our attacks on shipping. The Biden administration has consistently come out and said that the war in Gaza is contained. The fighting in the north between Hezbollah and Hezbollah, Lebanon's Party of God, and Israel is not related. The fighting between Yemen is not related. The other attacks by other militias, whether they be in Syria or Iraq, not related. So this attempt to kind of gaslight or diminish what's going on as a way of distracting the American public is one thing. But that's I think the readers will see a part of that consistent thread in the book as well. But let me get to the anecdote, which is this. So as the United States decides, it's not going to negotiate with the Houthis. In fact, it's going to send two major aircraft carriers and it's going to launch airstrikes against the Houthis.
Mm-hmm.
And President Biden will be asked by reporters outside the White House, are the airstrikes working? And President Biden will respond, are the airstrikes working? Do you mean that they are deterring the Houthis? No. Will they continue? Yes. And this fundamentally sums up U.S. foreign policy, I would argue, over the past 6 decades.
Mm-hmm.
If I had known that President Biden was going to say that, I probably would have held off on publishing the book just to use that to either to open the book or close out the book, because it is so telling about the state of American foreign policy and American diplomacy. Right?
Yes. Mm.
So that's one of the other takeaways I want readers to think about is, in what cases can diplomacy work, and why has the United States abandoned diplomacy? And I'd like the readers to think about the following. Why is it that diplomacy, for example, in the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, why is it that the initial response from Secretary of State Blinken was the following? We're not going to negotiate. We won't negotiate till the fighting's over. How do you expect the fighting to end?
Mm-hmm.
Right? How is it that then leaks came out that in the first month of the fighting, there were negotiations that the United States and the United Kingdom scuttled that could have ended the conflict? It happened again three to 6 months later. It happened a third time by the end of 2022. So we've completely enervated diplomacy. We haven't given it any priority. Instead, we keep relying on overwhelming uses of military force that in the end either entrench conflicts, as I talk about in the book, right, and make them more difficult to solve, or create other conflicts. Right. And this is one of the other aspects I would hope that the readers take away. It's one of the things I show in particular during the Bush administration, but it's not limited to the Bush administration.
Mm-hmm.
The Obama administration does the same thing. What's remarkable, I think, for the reader to take away is the following.
Mm-hmm.
When Donald Trump was elected, many were warned that he would lead the United States into even greater number of wars.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Now, one of the things Trump does is he takes kind of the Nixonian, and this I think what's interesting by doing the Kennedy to Biden arc as I do, he will adopt some of a Nixonian aspect, which is that he will attempt to expand certain conflicts in Yemen and Afghanistan and Iraq, and then dials it down. So much so that he is actually the president who signs the peace treaty to remove the United States out of Afghanistan. Now, you can criticize the peace treaty, right? But it's the same one that Biden agreed to uphold and withdrew U.S. forces, right? So there's yet another consistency there. Now, what's interesting about Trump's treaty is that this was available to the United States as far back as the end of the Bush administration. And I talk about in the book how the Bush administration had the opportunity for negotiations, had been pressured to agree, or had been at the request of the president of Afghanistan to include the Taliban in the government, to include the Taliban in negotiations, and the Bush administration refused. The Obama administration was also unwilling to do it. And it was the Trump administration that did it. So there are several consistencies I think readers can take away, but they should also think about why is it, for example, and here's the flip side on Trump when we talk about the militarization of U.S. foreign policy. As the COVID pandemic was beginning, right, one of the things that, according to leaks, is that, and keep in mind who's arguing for this, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is going to argue, as Iran is experiencing kind of the height of the COVID pandemic and that early spring 2020, now is a time to attack Iran. So remember, President Trump withdrew from the nuclear program agreement that President Obama signed, argued he could get a better deal. It's kind of the counterweight to what he did in Afghanistan, right? So we're going to withdraw from Afghanistan. We're going to put greater pressure on Iran. And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is going to argue now is the time to attack Iran. They're weak. They're distracted by COVID. We can hit them, and now we can force them to accept our terms on a nuclear weapons on a nuclear program, right? Who was actually, according to the leaks, who actually prevented this was the Pentagon. So I want you to think about that. You have the Secretary of State, America's top diplomat, arguing for military force. And you have the Pentagon and the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying, we can't start a war in the middle of a pandemic, right? So that's remarkable. But it's not the only example, because what have we seen since October 7th? We already had the example of Secretary of State Blinken in Ukraine. After October 7th, Secretary of State Blinken flies to Israel, participates in the war cabinet meetings. Why is America's top diplomat sitting in on Israel's war cabinet? That's not his role.
Yes.
The Secretary of State, and in fact, he actually compounded that by actually sending out, memo was leaked to the State Department in the first week that there'll be no talk of a ceasefire. There'll be no talk of de-escalation. So we talk about this militarization of foreign policy. You have a Secretary of State participating in a war cabinet meeting. Who's supposed to do that? Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Assistant Secretary of Defense. That's not the place for the Secretary of State. You have the Secretary of State out sending out messages and actually forbidding any discussion of diplomacy, de-escalation, ceasefire. To take us back to the Kennedy period. So as the United States, and this is where Vietnam becomes important, as you can see the outline of this, right? So by 1964, President Johnson is preparing for what's known as Operation Rolling Thunder. There's a deliberate decision for the United States by President Johnson and his advisors to escalate in Vietnam. And what they will talk about is a major bombing campaign of North Vietnam. And the idea is to, quote unquote, make the North beg for peace, right? Now, of course, this fails, right? If anything, it hardened it hardened the attitudes of the North Vietnamese, and it was unsuccessful in getting any change in policy. Now, fast forward to 2024. And of course, the war in Gaza is now in its second or third month. There has already been one negotiated humanitarian pause in which the most number of Israeli hostages taken on October 7th were released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, right? Over 100 plus. Now, instead of extending the humanitarian pause, instead, Israel canceled the humanitarian pause and then restarted military operations. What did Secretary of State Blinken say? All of this could be over tomorrow if Hamas surrenders. So you can draw a straight line from Operation Rolling Thunder and that massive bombing campaign of North Vietnam and this idea of making the North beg for peace to if Hamas surrenders, this can all be over, right? And in between, we have a number of different conflicts that I talk about in the book. So one of the reasons why I'm bringing up these anecdotes that are very present, I think, for most readers, is because it fits into this long line of American foreign policy and the militarized foreign policy that we've seen since the Kennedy administration, and of course, amplified by the Johnson administration and Nixon, and then, of course, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Bush again.
That's great. Our audience for this particular program is very interdisciplinary. We've had students, from different departments, psychology, international relations, history, and all that. What would you say is a specific target audience of this book who would greatly benefit if they have a chance to get their hands on this book?
Well, I think it's actually a very interdisciplinary book, right? So, and I've tried to write it in as accessible a style as I can, because you're trying to appeal to different audiences. I think it's really geared towards the undergraduate and graduate students more than, say, their professors, right? And the goal here is, I think there's enough introduction for those students that of whether they be in history or they be in IR or they be in the arts and sciences, because I also fold in some aspects of popular culture. Like we talked about 24, there are other examples there as well. Because one of the things as we talked about these examples of Vietnam is you will see the kind of the profound influence of the baby boomers on popular culture, including Vietnam War and the Vietnam War movies, is how that's taken and adopted in different examples. So it's not just in the social sciences or in the late social sciences, if you want to describe history that way, but also in arts and literature. What's really needed here is a reader who's actually interested in asking the questions that I'm interested in. Why are we always at war? Right? How did we get here? And how do we get out? So I think for me, what I would like is what it really wants is a reader who's actually asking these questions and is thinking about, how is it that the United States developed its policy, for example, toward Gaza? And I trace that out in the book, right? That leads you right up to October 7th. Okay. How is it the United States developed a policy on Yemen? How is it that the Houthis got this one? How is it that our drug policy is what it is, right? For example, how is it that we have this? If students are interested in this, how is it that we got to militarized policing? How does militarized policing connect us to overseas occupation armies? How is it that we have a drug policy that is influencing the rest of the world, right? So the United States is the world's biggest drug market, right?
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the world does not have the same problem the United States has.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we've been unwilling to deal with this issue for over 5 decades,
Mm-hmm.
right? Instead, what we've adopted is a drug policy that is heavy on enforcement,
Mm-hmm.
heavy on interdicting supply, but doesn't want to deal with the root issue because we don't want to understand addiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because we don't understand addiction, we've adopted these failed policies, right? Which are having, so one of the anecdotes I end with in the book, excuse me, is in 2019,
Mm-hmm.
where the admiral for Southern Command. So what is Southern Command? Southern Command is responsible for the quote unquote Southern Hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Southern Command has been quote unquote interdicting drug trafficking since the 1980s, if not, and we're talking the late 1980s, early 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So think about that. Over 3 decades of interdiction. Okay. And this is, as I describe in the book, this is, of course, heightened from the Reagan period into the first Bush administration,
Mm-hmm.
George Herbert Walker Bush, to where we are today. And what the Admiral of Southern Command admits in testimony to Congress is that the United States is interdicting less than 6%
Mm-hmm.
of the trafficking that comes in, spending billions, if not trillions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interdicting less than 6%
Mm-hmm.
of what's coming into the United States. And he will say to Congress, we can do more, but it's going to cost more money.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the traffickers can balance that.
Mm-hmm.
But if all you're interdicting is 6% after all these years, all right, what does that tell us about this failure in policy? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm also hoping is that students who are interested in things like, how did we get to a policy of assassination? How do we get to a policy of pervasive surveillance?
Mm-hmm.
This idea after 9/11 that, we have pervasive surveillance in the United States, right? And it's operationalized in several different ways, but it's not new. And that's one of the things I do is I take that back and I trace that back to, of course, protesting to the monitoring of the anti-war movement during the 1960s,
Mm-hmm.
into the 1970s, and to today. So how does the United States deal with dissent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Dissent to its policies. And you can see that acting out in the campus protests this past spring in relation to Gaza, but you're going to see even more of it, should we assume, depending on how the November election, what happens with the November election. So how does the United States respond to dissent, right? How does it respond to, how does it police its urban areas? And then how does it take those same policies and apply them overseas? Right.
Mm-hmm.
So for readers who are interested in that, I think there's a lot for the reader to take away from this.
That is awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Osamah Khalil, for making the time to talk to me here on this particular podcast. Viewers and listeners, those of you who are interested in getting a copy of this book, please do not forget to click the link that is right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Professor Osamah, thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
You too. Thanks so much.
That's great.